Most people think American factories disappeared because of globalization and cheap labor overseas, but they're completely wrong about that. Global competition didn't kill America's factory system at all. In fact, for many decades the United States dominated global manufacturing and built the most efficient industrial machine the world had ever seen. A system so powerful that it turned a country into the richest economy in history. But then something strange happened that nobody expected. Factories didn't slowly decline and fade away over time. They collapsed very quickly. Entire industrial cities that had been thriving for generations went quiet almost overnight. Production lines that once ran day and night suddenly stopped completely. And millions of good jobs vanished from the economy in a relatively short time. Not because the system stopped working or became inefficient, but because of one decision. One policy that quietly changed the incentives of the entire economy and how businesses thought about where to produce things. And once that policy happened, the perfect factory system began to disappear. At first glance, the explanation seemed simple and straightforward. Factories moved overseas because labor was cheaper in other countries than it was in America. That's the story most people hear when they think about why manufacturing left. But here's what most people miss when they analyze this problem. Cheap labor has always existed somewhere in the world throughout history. And yet for nearly a century, America kept most manufacturing at home. Even when wages in America were far higher than in Europe or Asia. So the real question isn't why factories left America eventually. The real mystery is much deeper than that. Why did the system work perfectly for almost 100 years without moving production overseas, and then suddenly stop working the way it had before? To understand that mystery, we need to go back to the moment America created the most powerful manufacturing engine in modern history. The story begins in the early 20th century when America had something truly unique that no other country possessed. Not just factories scattered around producing things, but an actual system, a carefully designed industrial ecosystem that connected everything together. At the center of it was mass production and the revolutionary idea of the assembly line. Companies like Ford Motor Company perfected the moving assembly line concept completely. Instead of hiring skilled craftsmen who could build entire products from start to finish, work was divided into thousands of small simple tasks. Each worker repeated one single motion over and over again, many times per day, every single day. The result was revolutionary and changed everything about manufacturing forever. Products became cheaper to make. Production became much faster. And output absolutely exploded compared to the old way of making things. But the real genius behind the system wasn't just the assembly line itself. It was the entire network that formed around it and connected it to everything else. Steel came from Pittsburgh in Pennsylvania. Rubber came from Ohio factories. Glass came from Indiana. Engines came from Michigan factories. And countless parts flowed between thousands of specialized suppliers every single day. Factories became connected like organs in a living body, each depending on the others. Detroit wasn't just building cars. It was coordinating an entire industrial organism that worked together seamlessly. This system became known as vertical industrial integration. And it made American manufacturing nearly unstoppable compared to any other country. By the middle of the 20th century, the United States produced almost half of the world's entire manufactured goods, which was an incredible share of global production. Cities like Detroit, Cleveland, and Pittsburgh became symbols of industrial power and American strength. During World War II, this factory system proved its true strength and capability. American factories produced ships, tanks, aircraft, and weapons at a speed that shocked and amazed the world. One factory could build a bomber plane every single hour. Another could launch a cargo ship every few days. The industrial machine ran non-stop day and night throughout the war. And by the end of the war, America had become the undisputed manufacturing capital of the world. For decades after the war, the system only grew stronger and more efficient. New technologies improved efficiency constantly. High wages created a powerful middle class of workers. Workers could afford to buy the products they built in the factories. Factories fueled consumer demand. Demand fueled more factories and expansion. It was a self-reinforcing cycle that seemed like it would last forever. An industrial golden age. But then the story begins to change in unexpected ways. By the 1960s and early 1970s, something unexpected began to happen to America's economy. America's industrial dominance was creating new pressures and problems within the global system. Factories were exporting goods around the world constantly. But the global financial system was under strain and stress. At the time, the world operated under something called the Bretton Woods system. Currencies were tied to the US dollar as the anchor, and the dollar itself was tied to gold. This system had worked since the end of World War II. But by the late 1960s, America was spending heavily on many things. The Vietnam War was costing enormous amounts of money. Massive social programs at home were expanding. Government deficits were rising higher and higher. Dollars were flooding the global system everywhere. Foreign governments began to worry about what would happen next. If the United States printed too many dollars, the promise to convert dollars into gold could break and fail. And in 1971, it did break exactly as people feared. President Richard Nixon made a historic decision that changed everything. He ended the dollar's convertibility into gold completely. The moment became known as the Nixon shock. At first, it looked like a technical monetary change that didn't matter much. But it triggered something far bigger than anyone expected. Currencies began to float on markets instead of staying fixed. Exchange rates became unstable and volatile. And for the first time, the US dollar could rise dramatically in value against other currencies. This is where the hidden shift in the economy began. This is the moment that would reshape American manufacturing forever. When a country's currency becomes stronger, its exports become expensive for foreign buyers. Its factories lose price competitiveness against factories in other countries. And its imports become cheaper to buy from overseas. After the 1970s, the US dollar experienced long periods of strength in global markets. Global capital began flowing into America's financial markets looking for returns. Wall Street expanded rapidly. Finance grew faster than it ever had. And this changed the incentives that corporations faced. Building factories requires patience and long-term thinking. Factories take years to construct properly. They take decades to perfect and improve. But financial markets reward speed and quick results. Short-term profits. Quarterly results that look good on paper. And rising stock prices. Suddenly, companies faced a new question that they had to answer. Why build expensive factories in the United States with high labor costs, when you could manufacture in countries with much lower labor costs? At first, only a few industries moved production overseas to countries like Mexico and Asia. But once the shift began, it accelerated very quickly. Global supply chains formed rapidly. Factories opened in Asia and countries like Taiwan, Korea, and eventually China. Shipping costs fell dramatically. Containerization revolutionized trade and made shipping cheap. The world's industrial map began to change. They often focus on globalization, or trade agreements, or automation and technology. But the deeper pattern is about incentives and how they shape behavior. For decades, the American system rewarded production and making things, building factories, engineering, improvements, scaling manufacturing, creating jobs. But after the 1970s, the economy slowly began rewarding something completely different: financialization of everything, money flowing through markets instead of through factories. Corporate profits increasingly came from financial engineering rather than industrial innovation. Stock buybacks that enriched shareholders, mergers and acquisitions of competitors, debt finance growth that looked good on paper. Meanwhile, the industrial ecosystem started breaking apart piece by piece. Once a supplier factory closed, the entire supply chain weakened. Once the chain weakened, rebuilding it became almost impossible to do. Factories don't exist in isolation or by themselves. They rely on thousands of invisible connections to other factories. Once those connections vanish, the system collapses. And that's exactly what happened to America. Today, the consequences are visible everywhere in the country if you look for them. Former factory towns struggle with unemployment and declining populations year after year. Entire regions of the country lost their industrial base and have never recovered. Meanwhile, The global manufacturing center shifted completely to Asia. Countries like China built massive factory networks that now dominate production. Supply chains that once existed in the United States now exist overseas, and ironically, many American companies still depend on those same factories in other countries. The COVID era. Supply shortages revealed something important about the world. Supply chains that had become global were incredibly fragile. Governments suddenly realized something that they should have understood earlier. Industrial systems are not easy to rebuild once they disappear. Factories can be built in a few years if you have the capital, but industrial ecosystems take decades to develop and mature. Once lost, they are incredibly difficult to recreate because all the knowledge and connections vanish. But the deeper lesson is not really about factories at all. It's about incentives and how they shape everything. Economic systems follow rewards and incentives. When governments reward production, factories grow. When they reward financial activity, capital flows into markets. When they reward consumption, imports rise. The American factory system didn't disappear because it failed or became bad at making things. It disappeared because the system stopped rewarding it and making it profitable. Capital simply followed the path of highest financial return. And over time, that path moved away from industrial production at home, toward finance in cities like New York, toward global supply chains in other countries, toward a different kind of economy. There's a strange pattern in economic history that repeats over and over. Great systems rarely collapse because they stop working. They collapse because the rules around them change. Rome didn't fall in a day. Neither did the great trading empires of Venice and the Dutch Republic, and neither did America's factory system. It slowly lost the incentives that once made it powerful: the assembly lines, the supplier networks, the industrial cities. They were all part of something larger, a carefully balanced system that worked together. Once the balance shifted, the system quietly unraveled. And today, many countries are asking the same difficult question: can an industrial ecosystem be rebuilt once it disappears completely? Or is it something that only grows once in history when the conditions are exactly right? Because in economics, the most powerful forces are often invisible to people: incentives, rules, and the quiet policies that reshape entire systems without anyone noticing until it's too late. The Nixon shock wasn't intended to destroy American manufacturing. It was a practical response to a currency problem. But policies have consequences that ripple through systems in ways that policymakers don't always anticipate. The strong dollar made imports cheap and exports expensive. That single economic fact, repeated over decades, moved production overseas. Nobody planned it that way. No government ordered factories to close. But the incentives were structured in a way that made moving production profitable for companies, and companies, acting rationally, followed those incentives. They moved production to where costs were lower and profits were higher. This is the real story. Not a conspiracy or a deliberate plan to destroy American industry, but a quiet shift in incentives that slowly reshaped the entire economy. Today, as countries face new challenges from supply chain disruptions and geopolitical tensions, many governments are trying to rebuild manufacturing at home. They're offering subsidies, tax breaks. They're trying to make manufacturing profitable again in their countries, but they're discovering something important. Building factories is easy. Building industrial ecosystems is hard. Because ecosystems require hundreds of thousands of small connections, millions of relationships between companies, decades of accumulated knowledge and expertise. Once those connections break apart, rebuilding them is incredibly expensive and time-consuming. The United States learned this lesson the hard way. What took a century to build took only a few decades to tear apart, and rebuilding will take many decades more. This is what history teaches us about systems. They grow slowly and die slowly when incentives change, and the policies that seem small and technical today can reshape entire industries and regions for generations to come.